Good evening, wherever you may be around the city, across the state. Welcome to the Heart of Chicago. Mr. Moeller, going to be taking you through the second part of early U.S. politics, dealing with what happens when George Washington leaves and political parties become the norm. So, as we talked about in the last Flip lecture, early U.S. politics, when Washington steps down as the president, it kind of leaves the country in a little bit of a crisis. The presidency had always been designed for him. He was the most respected man. And so what ends up happening is that Washington's last speech, he's going to warn everybody about things. He says, don't make political parties, don't fight North and South, and don't get involved in foreign wars that America is not involved in. All of which the U.S. will be involved in less than 10 years after, Washington leaves. So the first major political parties in American history are going to be the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. So the Federalists are pretty much going to be the same as the Federalists during the Constitution debate, and the Democratic Republicans are going to represent a lot of the concerns of the Anti-Federalists. And so if you're thinking about like what are these parties going to disagree about, well, states versus federal government, economic policy, plantation trade south, manufacturing north, foreign policy, French Revolution's going on, Napoleonic Wars are happening. What should the United States do? And so these are the major issues, along with obviously taxes and tariffs, that are going to divide the country and therefore divide the first two political parties. And so on issues of federalism, which government should be supreme, the Federalists were in favor of a strong national government. The Democratic Republicans, the opposite, state governments. The Federalists that represented kind of more northern interests were very much into manufacturing, banking, finance, those types of things for money. It should be the basis of America, so they said. Whereas Democratic Republicans, kind of representing the South, the West, led by Thomas Jefferson, they're going to say, hey, plantation economics, agricultural trade, this is what America should be based on. And so because of that, Federalists are in favor of tariffs and Democratic Republicans are going to be against them. And then there's even this question of like the Constitution, where the Federalists want to be able to imply powers, right, to expand what the federal government can do. And the Democratic Republicans in favor of states, they want a very narrow interpretation of powers so that everything will go to the states rather than the federal government. And so these battle lines are going to be kind of similar even as we change political parties throughout this year. So the first major presidential election without George Washington is 1796, in which the Federalists run John Adams, very famous from the Revolution, and same thing with Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson, and by a very, very narrow margin, Adams is going to win the presidency. And so when Adams comes in as a Federalist, he's immediately faced with an international crisis. Again, being president, sometimes you just have to deal with crises. And so what happens in France is that the French Revolution overthrows the King of France, who was America's ally in that Revolutionary War. And so there's this question of like, does the United States still live up to its obligations to a government that they did not make an alliance with? And so that's kind of controversial. France, for their part, actually came to the United States. They sent 3 guys who were agents who became known as X, Y, and Z. And they actually asked the President of the United States for bribes. They demanded bribes, all sorts of things. And so the United States felt that the new French revolutionary government was disrespecting them. So while there was no declaration of war, the United States goes and fights this quasi-war, this semi-war, this not quite war, in fighting in the Atlantic, kind of over like with ships. And so this kind of becomes America's first undeclared war. But it's during this quasi-war that John Adams and the Federalists are going to make some decisions that are going to cause controversy. So during wartime, sometimes speech is going to be restricted. And so during the quasi-war, the Federalists passed a law called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Alien meaning foreigner, and sedition meaning treason, or kind of like, undercutting the country. And so the justification for this was national security. Maybe you've heard this before with surveillance. It's usually the excuse governments give. And so it was actually aimed primarily at Irish and French immigrants who were supporters of the Democratic Republicans. Their idea was that kind of, the French people could be spies for the French. The Irish, were anti-British, and so they were suspect. And what these laws allowed was for deportation without due process, without a trial. And it also made it a federal crime to criticize the government. You guys might be thinking, well, hey, Mr. Moeller, wait, we have freedom of speech. We have the Fifth Amendment, guarantees us due process. And so that's actually exactly what people at the time are asking, like, wait, isn't this illegal for the government to do it? And so we have our first, what I would call kind of constitutional crisis, where it comes into play, what does this document mean, and is the government doing something illegal? And so two states, Virginia and Kentucky, are actually going to draft resolutions, basically statements, in which they say that states have the right, because they made the Constitution, they made the federal government, to declare laws unconstitutional. They call this nullification. They said we can nullify a law, like null and void, right? And so this is a huge moment in the story, because the federal government is going to claim this right, judicial review, and now states are claiming this right, nullification, to decide what the Constitution is going to say. And so what we have now are two major opposing viewpoints on how to read the Constitution. Is it the Supreme Court? Is it the states that should do this? And that issue is not going to be resolved until the end of the American Civil War. And so look for that issue to come back, but it comes up for the first time very early on in American history. After kind of John Adams has 4 years, there's another election that features Adams versus Jefferson, and this one is a little bit more nasty. If you ever think, elections are mean and people put out negative ads, it's been that way since the very, very beginning. A lot of people, call Thomas Jefferson an atheist and try to paint John Adams as like the Christian candidate. Democratic Republicans with Jefferson tried to paint Adams as like, a pawn of the British world order. And so when you think about this, kind of like elections, they've always kind of been nasty. This is nothing new. It's something very deep in our history. And so in 1800, Thomas Jefferson wins the presidency from John Adams. And when he comes in, he shakes everything up. So Democratic Republicans are coming in after the Federalists have been in power. And Thomas Jefferson believes in a small federal government, powerful states, that America should be based on agriculture and trading that agriculture, and that the Southern plantation culture is more American than the Northern banking merchant culture in, say, a city like New York. So he comes in and completely is looking to change everything, which he does. Basically, drawing upon the spirit of the Revolution in 1776, he shrunk the size of the federal government, ended the whiskey tax, lessened the tariffs, cut the army in order to cut costs, and also he was afraid, like the Whiskey Rebellion, right? The federal government using the army to oppress people. And he was also huge into Western expansion. He thought that more land would mean more agriculture, mean more people would be involved in agriculture. And so he was actually behind the Louisiana Purchase as well. But he distrusted bankers, merchants. He owed a lot of money to a lot of people. And so Thomas Jefferson comes in and just changes everything. Things have been tipping towards the federal government having more power. Now they're going to start tipping back towards the states. It's also in 1800 that completion of the new capital is kind of underway. And in 1800, the U.S. government moves to Washington, D.C., a new capital that's been built to house the government. So after Jefferson comes in and kind of, does a lot of different things, after him is James Madison, who's going to serve for 8 years. James Madison, he's another Virginian, he's another Democratic Republican, and there's going to be a series of these guys that are all Democratic Republicans, that are all Virginians, that are going to kind of keep these policies going. So kind of moving away from the political parties, America has to deal with what's going on in the world politics, right? And so there's a ton of tensions in the world over wars, over trade, and a lot of this really kind of comes down to things that are outside of the United States' control. And so the really big thing that happens after 1787 is the French Revolution. French Revolution is a huge thing. It blows up Europe's world order. It leads to Napoleonic Wars. But America's successful revolution leads to a bunch around the world. There's a revolution in Haiti. The Irish Rebellion, they're going to be unsuccessful. They're going to fight for independence and lose to Great Britain. Simon Bolivar is involved in wars in what kind of was Spain's colonies in the Americas, kind of getting those countries their freedom. And so there's a lot of dominoes. The world is in a lot of upheaval at this time, and America kind of ends up getting caught in middle of it. Similar to today, where kind of around 2010, 2012, there was a lot of political upheaval across the Middle East. And we're still dealing with the fallout from that, still dealing with those wars, kind of all these years later. And so Washington, when he was in, he tried to stay out. Neutrality, right? I don't need to get involved in your war. And that's the huge thing that he starts with. He does not want to get involved in France's Revolutionary Wars, the wars between France and Britain. And so the United States actually breaks off its alliance with France, saying, hey, we had a leader, so we had an alliance with your leader, the king. We don't have an alliance with this new revolutionary government that you guys are setting up. And eventually, that is actually what led to the Quasi-War under Adams. And so in France, the Reign of Terror happens, and there's a lot of disagreement in America about how we should respond. In theory, right, they're trying to set up a democracy, a republic like ours. But at the same time, they're causing wars. And so honestly, one of the biggest controversies in early American history has nothing to do with America at all. It has to do with what America was going to do about France. And so we have the XYZ affair, the Quasi-War. And so it became very clear early on that America would not be able to stay out of international affairs. Their trade is too wrapped up in it. And so once we get to Jefferson, things are going to start to change after 1800. Napoleon comes to power, and to make money, he sells Louisiana to the United States. Napoleon also starts a series of wars that threaten American trade, threaten American shipping, and so Jefferson is going to have to deal with all of these wars that are breaking out in Europe, not even anywhere near the United States. Also, too, pirates were attacking U.S. shipping off the Barbary Coast in North Africa, and so Thomas Jefferson fought a series of pirate wars called the Barbary Wars, and all of this is about America trying to find out what its place in the international order is going to be. And so if you look at this map, we'll talk about Louisiana Purchase in a later video, but it doubles the size of the United States. A very good deal that Thomas Jefferson pulls off. So let's just talk for a second about the Napoleonic Wars. So these could be considered world wars. They're happening kind of all over the place between France and their allies and Britain and their allies. And the United States had tried to stay out of all these wars, declared neutrality. But the problem with America is that we're trading with both sides. We're trading with France and Britain and, this country. And so what ends up happening is these countries don't like that America is helping their enemies. And so both Britain and France restrict trade with the United States, saying you have to pick one. Pick France, pick Britain, but you have to pick one. And the United States did not want to do that because that would cause a major, major loss of revenues. And so that was a major controversy. Another one was that British ships would sometimes search American ships for deserters and then force them into military service. Well, they picked up accidentally a few U.S. citizens, and so this again comes down to respect. America does not like the restrictions. America does not like this impressment, and so therefore America is going to look to try to push back a little bit to get that respect that they're looking for. And they first pushed back by banning trade with France and Britain, the embargo. Well, the embargo doesn't really work. The United States needs more trade needs trade more with Britain and France than Britain and France need trade with them. So what they're left with is a situation where America does an embargo, hurts America, doesn't hurt them enough, and therefore this boycott ends up not working out at all. Only thing it does is make Thomas Jefferson unpopular. But in 1808, James Madison takes over in the middle of all of this stuff. He's going to be reelected in 1812 after trying to deal with all of these issues with the Napoleonic Wars. And Madison is going to face kind of some tough choices. He first faces the end of the National Bank, and he lets it die. He was not a fan of the National Bank. He was very much a fan of states' power over the federal government. And he also kept that low tax and those very kind of small military policies in place. Well, the problem with that is that Madison was also feeling pressure to go to war, to fight back against Britain, fight back against France, push back, and the U.S. does not have the money, does not have a bank to help pay or make loans, and they don't have an army and navy strong enough to really be doing any of this. So when America stumbles into the War of 1812 because they feel the need to do something, they're very unprepared because of the last 12 years of policy. But if you're James Madison, you got a lot of people yelling at you to go to war with Britain. Trade restrictions, impressment, British supporting Native Americans during the Indian Wars. All of this stuff puts pressure on James Madison to do something. And so Americans call for war. Other Americans say this is insane, and they have their reasons. But America declares war on Britain in 1812 over these issues. For Britain, they really can't believe it. Britain is fighting a world war in France, and so in this war, they're never going to actually commit. But America decides they're going to fight. The British are going to just send the minimum amount of troops they think they need to win, and they're actually going to win a lot of victories. America fails every invasion of British Canada. The capital is attacked, captured, and burned to the ground. The White House is burned to the ground. It's a fun story. Look it up. But ultimately, this is a war that Britain's not serious about. The Americans are losing. And so when the opportunity presents itself for both sides to walk away, they both walk away. No one wins, no one loses, everything is the exact same as it was before. But, because Americans love, to claim victories, the Battle of New Orleans happens actually after the war was over. The treaty had been signed, but then this battle takes place. And so this last battle of the war in New Orleans has a couple of big effects. One, it allows Americans to claim they won the war, right? Talked about that with the Revolution. It's not about what happens, it's about what you can claim happened and what people believe. And so America says, hey, we beat Britain again. 2 times we beat Britain. We're undefeated against Great Britain. It also launches the career of a guy called Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is going to be in play in this story very, very soon, and he becomes a war hero, one of the most famous Americans living because of the Battle of New Orleans. And this also ushers in a time known as the era of good feelings. The feeling that America, being victorious in 1812, expanding west, that America was really chosen, called to be this greatest nation of the future. And so it's a feeling of victory. And it's also a feeling that Americans are now American. Before 1812, the states and the colonies had never fought under one banner. The Continental Army was made up of 13 separate armies from 13 separate states. For the first time, America went to war and was victorious as one nation under the American flag. And so because of this, unity, nationalism, USA is emphasized, and James Monroe comes in, and he's inaugurated president, and he leads us through this time. And in his first speech, he says that, our government is near perfection. We are so happy. We cannot fail. God is on our side, and America has a great destiny to fulfill. And that becomes the ethos of the era of good feelings. Pride in America, favoring the U.S. government over your state government, an aggressive foreign policy that is not afraid to confront major world powers about whatever issues. And this also, for a short time, the tensions between North and South and West, tensions between the political parties, they lessen. And there is a kind of a brief time of unity. But that was not to be short-lived. That was to be short-lived. Because what's going to end up happening is Western expansion is going to pull slavery back into the main kind of vision of Americans. The increase in federal government power that's going to happen is going to cause pushback by states' rights people. And the aggressive foreign policy by the United States is going to begin a legacy of the United States being involved in Latin America and other places that we're still dealing with up to this day. And so when we're looking at kind of American politics, it is a shifting landscape in which we're trying to come up with America's place in the world, how this government is going to work, and what happens when the government does things that it's not supposed to do. And so that's where we're going to leave this one, and we'll talk about this a little bit further. Have a great rest of your day.